Okay, so for today's lecture, we are going to talk about Louise Erdrich's short story called The Shawl. And this one isn't actually in our anthology. This one is available online, and I gave you a link on our course homepage. But this short story does deal with some themes or ideas that are going to be important for us as we go on throughout the semester. Louise Erdrich writes about intergenerational trauma. So, how does one traumatic event affect not only the person who witnessed it or experienced it, but also has long lasting effects for that individual as well as the other individuals in that person's life? So, we'll see how that idea of intergenerational trauma plays out within the family uh, that are involved in the shawl. So let's do a little brief introduction to our author. So Louise Erdrich is an American Anishinaabe writer. And in her writing, she does do a lot of short fiction, like short stories, but she also does novels. And she does a lot of sort of interconnected characters who kind of interweave their lives between each other. So there's a lot of sort of interconnections, interweaving of characters and different families throughout her fiction. In this short story, we do get a glimpse at a First Nations family, an Anishinaabe family, and the events that play out across time for this one family, different generations of the same family. But she does, in her writing, Erdrich does tend to explore some of the themes and ideas related to First Nations culture and worldviews. In the story, we get kind of a traditional Anishinaabe family, their experience living in the forest, very secluded, isolated. But then we also see sort of changes to the community as they are taken off the land and placed into sort of reservations. Government moved everybody off the farthest reaches of the reservation and into housing, and this had sort of destructive effects on the First Nations Anishinaabe community that she's writing about. So we do get glimpses of change and time, how those effects of government and race and culture, all those, how they change across time for this one family in the shawl. One of the interesting literary devices that Louise Erdrich is using is point of view, and we haven't talked too much about point of view, but it's very important in the story to understand that there are sort of multiple perspectives or different points of view being represented in the story. So the speaker of the story will become kind of important, and it's not revealed to the very end how the sort of point of view is very important in the shawl. And another aspect that is kind of interesting about Louise Erdrich's writing is her use, her kind of integration or code switching. She'll use Ojibwe words in her, they're English stories, but she'll incorporate language of the Anishinaabe or First Nations languages into her writing. So for those of us who aren't familiar with those words, it can be a little, you might have to look up some words or try to trace or sort of figure out through context clues what those words mean. But it's a way for her to sort of integrate a lot of First Nations culture and worldviews within her writing by creating an English story, but also incorporating language, traditional language into her stories. And it's an interesting feature that Erdrich does. So let's look at some literary devices in this short story. So in general, when you're doing a literary analysis, there are lots of different aspects that you can look at. And if you're writing an essay on a short story, you wouldn't have to talk about all of these things, but I would pick, narrow down your focus. Are you going to focus just on the characters? Are you going to look at the diction or language? Are you going to pick one theme or look at a conflict between two characters? So you really have to narrow it down when you're writing or doing a literary essay to which aspect of the text you're going to focus in on. So that's something for when you're writing your paper or decide to create your own thesis statements, is to sort of narrow your focus. So you can't do everything. You can't talk about character and theme and symbols and conflict and diction all in one paper. You really have to pick and choose what you're going to deal with and narrow down your thesis. So it's really essential to do that. But if we can just do an overview of the story, we can look at some of these specific literary devices and how they're developed over the course of the story. So we'll look at characters and characterization. We'll take a look more closely at some of the diction or language that Erdrich is using in the short story. We can talk about conflict. Every story will have a conflict. We'll look at some themes or bigger ideas. We'll do a little bit of discussion about the time, place, history, and cultural context of this short story. The symbols, if there's any key quotations, and by the end of reading you should be able to do a plot summary as well. So in one paragraph, can you describe what happens in that story? Is another way to sort of test your understanding. Okay, so the first literary device we can look at is characters and characterization. The structure of the story is kind of interesting. You almost do have like two parts to it. The first part takes place within a very sort of isolated community and a family. And the focus, the sort of protagonist, seems to be Anaquid, who is a Ashinabi woman who has she has two children with her husband, but she has just given birth to a baby, and the father is not her husband. So she's been having an affair with another man who she's in love with. She's unhappy in her marriage, and she is planning to leave her husband, take the baby, take her daughter to go live with this other man. So if we think about the characterization of Anaquid, she does seem, it depends on how you judge her, but she's described as sort of very moody, a lot of anger, frustration, possibly because she's unhappy in her marriage, but she's described in the first paragraph. Her name was Anaquid, which means cloud, and like a cloud she was changeable. She was moody and sullen one moment, her lower lip jetting and her eyes flashing, filled with storms. The next she would shake her hair over her face and blow it straight out in front of her to make her children scream with laughter. So she's sort of changeable, her mood, very moody, sometimes angry. Her husband seems to be kind of scared of her because she does have this bad temper. So it's the daughter, the young daughter, that ends up taking care of the family more than often because Anaquid seems to be preoccupied or angry or sleeping, or she just was having a difficult time of it. So the young daughter is the one who kind of takes on this maternal role. Her husband finally admits to himself that their life isn't good together, that their marriage isn't working, so he agrees that his wife can go and live with this other man, but they argue about the children. They disagree about which child should stay or which children should be allowed to go. Anaquid takes the daughter and then the baby with her, and then the son stays with the father. And it's a very traumatic event, having, in the first place, you have the young son not wanting to let his mother leave, crying and following after the wagon when his mother leaves. So there is this kind of idea of abandonment for the young son, who's only age 5 at this time, and it becomes even more difficult once we realize that the wagon is going to be attacked by wolves, resulting in the daughter's death. And it's apparent that this young son, this whole experience has left him very traumatized, and he carries with him this memory of his mother's abandonment and his sister's death with him long after. So the boy's experience of this event is described. So it says, "For a time the boy had no understanding of what had happened. His father kept what he knew to himself, at least that first year. And when his son asked about his sister's torn plaid shawl and why it was kept in the house, his father said nothing. But he wept when the boy asked if his sister was cold. It was only after his father had been weakened by the disease, and he began to tell the story far too often and always the same way. He told how when the wolves closed in, a Nakwid had thrown her daughter to them. When his father said those words, the boy went still. What had his sister felt? What had thrust through his heart? Had something broken inside her too, as it had in him? Even then he knew that this broken place inside him would not be mended, except by some terrible means. For he kept seeing his mother put the baby down and grip his sister around the waist. He saw Nakwid swing the girl lightly over the side of the wagon. He saw the brown shawl with its red lines flying open. He saw the shadows, the wolves, rushing together, quick and avid, as the wagon with sled runners disappeared into the distance forever. For neither he nor his father saw Nakwid again." So the way the father tells the story, his wife threw the daughter over the wagon to the wolves, and that's how the young girl died. And the boy hears this story and feels broken inside. In fact, he felt broken when he saw his mother leave him. So if our character and characterization of Anaquid, we could see her as very selfish, very passionate, very angry, quick to temper. You would view her as very, selfish in her act of throwing the daughter over the wagon. If you understood her husband, we see how he is also traumatized. He has he's suffering from a disease, so he's got tuberculosis, but he also is struggling with his memories. He seems very bitter about his wife leaving him, and when he is getting sicker and sicker, he ends up telling this story over and over and over and over again to his son about how Anaquid threw his daughter over and sacrificed her to the wolves in order to save herself and the rest of the people in the wagon. And then we have the young son who witnessed his mother leaving, and then the daughter's death. And he describes himself as broken inside. And there's a little bit of foreshadowing there as well when it says he knew that this broken place inside him would not be mended except by some terrible means. So we don't understand what that means yet at this point in the story, but that will become more clear as the story goes on. But this son is clearly traumatized from this event and broken inside. And then the daughter who has died, she was conveyed very sort of as a kind-hearted, very gentle, loving, nurturing, almost like a maternal figure, even though she's only 9 years old. Very kind person. And her death is really what causes this family to be broken apart. So that is part one of the story. Part two happens, there's the first sentence, when I was little, my own father terrified us with his drinking. So there's sort of a shift in the perspective, the point of view in which the story is told. So it shifts from third person to first person. So part two is all in first person. And now we get more information. So this narrator, the speaker, is talking about his own experience, his family growing up, and how he and his siblings, Doris and Raymond, two twin siblings, were all terrified of their father because when he would drink, he would start beating the children and getting very abusive, because when he drank, he would start sort of taking out his aggression on his children. And the children ended up, running away to the forest when they tried to avoid his father. So they would sneak off to the woods whenever their father would get drunk and angry. And then they started they stopped sort of thinking him as even a father or even as a human being, and they started to sort of distance themselves from their father. And it ends that there's a turning point in that second half of the story where the son ends up confronting his father, and he had grown. So as a young man, he grows stronger, and he thinks he can fight back. So he's no longer afraid of his father, and so he ends up confronting his father, and it's a turning point for their relationship. So when they fight, he hits his father, and eventually they sort of give up in their fighting, and he picks up an old blanket, which turns out to be this shawl. And it turns out that this shawl was the same shawl that the young daughter had in part one. So there's a connection between these two parts of the story, and it relates to how whatever happened in part one, the traumatic death of the daughter, how that has impacted the young boy who is now a father to his own children. And we get the son reflecting back on his experience and how he helped his father see this traumatic event in a new way. So he helps his father kind of let go of the past, and we do get a sense, kind of a positive ending, where there might be a way of healing for this family to finally break this cycle of abuse and trauma, and possibly find some healing from this traumatic event. So the son actually helps his father, and he helps him view his sister's death in a new way. So he proposes that this young girl wasn't thrown to the wolves, but instead she was such a kind, gentle, nurturing kind of soul that she sacrificed herself in order to save others, because she saw that the only way for the rest of those people on the wagon to survive the attack by the wolves was to sacrifice herself. So the son helps the father view this event in a new way. So we do see how these characters sort of change and grow, and they're not static. Especially the father and son in part two, we see how their relationship changes over the course of that section. So if you're looking at just the diction or language of a short story, it's always a good idea to write down any words you don't understand or circle them and then look them up in the dictionary. That's always the first thing that I do if I don't know a word. And then another way is just to sort of go through the story almost paragraph by paragraph and circle or underline the words that really pop out to you. So which are the key words, the words that you think are important, or the words that really stand out and set the tone of the story, because an author is selecting language very particularly. They're using words in a meaningful way. So we as readers can sort of pull out even, one or two words and really focus in on them and understand that every word in a short story has a role to play and can be an important part of it. In this short story, we do get words that maybe you're not familiar with. So the then words in Anishinaabe, like Gego or Manadug or Amaniso, these are all sort of words that maybe you have to look up in the dictionary or online to sort of understand. If you didn't do that, you'd have to just kind of guess what the meaning of the words were based on sort of context clues. So reading the rest of the sentence and kind of guessing what it is. But I've actually looked up the words here in case you want to go back, reread those sections, and it maybe will make a little bit more sense to you. But this is something that Louise Erdrich is doing purposefully, right? She wants to integrate this language, First Nations language, into her writing as a way to sort of reflect the family, the culture, and the traditions of the Anishinaabe. But it's another way to sort of take us or put us into that atmosphere of the story, right? So she's preserving a certain part of First Nations culture by adding these words in, but it's also a way to sort of really represent this family and the traditional ways and cultural ways that were often lost. And that's another kind of theme or idea, is lost culture. So this story also has a lot of conflict in it, and we'll find with every story that you read, there has to be some sort of conflict or complication to set the rising action of a story, right? So you do need something to happen. There has to be a conflict or struggle, whether it's external or internal, but there has to be a kind of conflict. In this story, we have both external and internal conflicts. You have a kind of external conflict in the antagonistic relationship between the husband and wife in the first part, or between the father and son in the second part. So these are people who are at odds with one another. They're fighting with one another. They're disagreeing. They're not getting along. That's a kind of external conflict. You could also have external conflict in the wolves, right? So this is a kind of force of nature that is outside of yourself, that's affecting your life, causing conflict or complicating things. So the wolves attacking the wagon. Nothing would have happened without that event occurring, right? So that's another kind of conflict that sets up the rest of the story. You could also have internal conflict. So this is generated within one person. So they might feel torn about themselves within and the inside. So maybe Anaquid had an internal struggle about what to do. Maybe her unhappiness and her temper had to do with feeling internally conflicted about being in love with another man. So there's that kind of internal conflict. Or maybe the husband felt conflicted inside when he saw his wife leave him, when he was suffering from disease and he kept thinking over and over about his memories. So those memories caused him to feel conflicted. The loss of his daughter is another kind of conflict. So all these things would play into and develop characterization as well. If you look at internal conflict and not just the external things that happen to characters. Obviously, the father and son in the second half are also dealing with conflict. So if we're looking at specifically themes or big ideas of the story, there's a lot that you can do. So this is how we interpret the story. So we might interpret larger themes or ideas within the narrative, and your list might look different than my list, but we are sort of as readers, looking for bigger ideas. So, what does the story mean on a deeper level? What does it have to say? What's its message? Those types of questions can be answered or asked when you're thinking or considering theme. So, one of the themes that I really focus in on in this story is the effects of trauma. So, trauma could be a theme, and particularly intergenerational trauma is evident in this story. So you do see how an event can, even though it just lasted, a few moments when Anaquid left the family with the daughter, and then the wolves came and attacked the wagon, and then the daughter died. That event ended, but the effects of that event had long lasting repercussions or consequences on this family, on the survivors. Obviously, the husband mourned the loss of his daughter, and he suffered in disease, and he would tell that story over and over and over and over again to his son. And then the son grows up, becomes heavily into, alcohol abuse, and then abuses his own children. And we can sort of trace some of this, his psychological damage, to this memory of his sister, the loss of his sister. So we do see how these effects trickle down through generation after generation. And there are sort of cycles of abuse and trauma that kind of follow families through generations. We also could look at the theme of sacrifice, because this becomes important to understanding how the different characters view this death of this young daughter, this girl. And this idea of sacrifice, or giving up one's life on purpose, or being sacrificed by somebody else. Sort of that theme or idea can be played out in this story as well. So the little girl can either be viewed as being sacrificed by her mother and dying, or she maybe self-sacrificed herself, gave her own life to save others. So depending on your perception, your take on that story, you might view that sacrifice as different, depending on your perspective. The theme of healing is also part of this story. So you do have this idea that the past has to be let go. There has to be a sort of closure or healing to occur, especially in a traumatic event occurring. There has to be some sort of healing for that individual to move on, to get over their pain and the memory, and to move on in a healthy way. We do get that sense of healing in the final section of the story, where the son tells his father that he should not hold on to the sister's shawl. That was wrong. He should burn it and then send that shawl to his sister's spirit. So that would be a way of closure, burning the shawl and letting go of that memory, that traumatic event. And it was also a way of asking the father to sort of start viewing this event differently. So looking at that memory in a new way can give him a new perspective and bring healing to this family as well. And there's kind of this indication that maybe this confrontation between father and son was really a good thing, because maybe their family can start healing from that traumatic event and move forward in a more healthy and happy family, no longer torn apart by traumatic memory. And then the final theme could relate to perceptions of reality or storytelling, because this story does do a lot with perspective. It sort of switches halfway through. So it starts off being third person, and then it switches to first person, and then it's revealed that The father in the second half of the story is really the son from the first half, so you have this kind of connection that's not revealed until the end. And just the way the son helps his father view the past in a new way does give some insight into how, you know, this idea that all of our past experiences can be interpreted in different ways depending on how we view them or how we perceive what happened. And there is also this importance of storytelling as a way of kind of sharing our life with others and possibly finding a way to bring closure to traumatic events. So storytelling does play a central part in bringing healing to this family, looking at the past in a new way, and also reveals some of the connections between the past and the present in the story. Lastly, you could also look at sort of the historical context as and determine sort of the aspects of the setting that are important to a short story. In this one, setting is important, and it's only sort of gained an understanding of it if you look at the details of the story. So part one is set on a kind of secluded road. In the first line of the story, among the Ashanabeg on the road where I live, it is told how a woman loved a man other than her husband and went off into the bush and bore his child. You do get a sense of this is a story that's told repeatedly in this community. And this one family grew up living in kind of an isolated area amongst a sort of traditional Anishinaabe community. And it does have a sense of in the past, right? This is a time gone by. Things have changed. There's more modernization, more, government intervention, and the culture, the old ways have somewhat been lost across time. And so some of that atmosphere is created in the horse and wagon. That's not a tradition, or that's more of a traditional way of traveling. You do get a sense of possibly that this was set during the fur trade, and that's kind of included when they describe the wolves and the relationship between the Anishinaabe people and the wolves. Because there is this belief that the wolves had a kind of agreement. So it says, the shadows' tracks were the tracks of wolves. And in those days, when our guns had taken all their food for furs and hides to sell, the wolves were bold and had abandoned the old agreement between them and the first humans. So this does sort of set the first part of the story at the time when there was kind of a fur trade going on, and all of the wolves' natural prey had been shot and, sold in the fur trade. So the wolves were attacking humans. And then in the second part of the story, you do get a sort of a stronger shift in time. So the traditional ways are considered, long gone. And it does talk about how the government's intervention in the lives of this First Nations community has had somewhat devastating effects on it. So it's described, there was a time when the government moved everyone off the farthest reaches of the reservation onto roads, into towns, into housing. It looked good at first, and then it all went sour. Shortly afterwards, it seemed that anyone who was someone was either drunk, killed, near suicide, or just dusted himself. None of the old sort were left. It seemed the old kind of people, the Atanajbe, were kind beyond kindness and would do anything for others. It was during that time that my mother died and my father hurt us, as I have said. So we do get a sense that times have changed, not just for this family, but for the larger community and culture. Governments interventions had devastating effects, and there was none of the old sort left. And the old sort, the Gete Ashinabe, are kind of represented in that young girl who sacrifices herself to help others. So they are kind beyond kindness, so gentle and kind, and will do anything for others. That sort of person is no longer around. So you do get a sense of change across time in the story. And then, of course, we have to talk about symbolism in the story as well, as it's very essential. Obviously, the title of the story is The Shawl, so that gives us a hint right away that a symbol is very important in understanding. So as readers, we can interpret the symbol, and usually a symbol is something concrete, like you could touch it, it's felt or seen. It has to be an object of some, concrete nature, but it's going to represent larger, more abstract ideas. So in this case, we have the concrete item is the shawl that the young daughter would wear, and then it's what the father holds onto or her brother holds onto in the second half of the story. So the shawl becomes a symbol of multiple things, really. It could be viewed as a symbol of a traumatic memory of the sister's death, and that's why the father holds on to it, so it could represent that for him. And burning it sort of lets that traumatic memory go. It could also be a symbol of the lost old ways, the lost culture, and change within the larger traditional Anishinaabe community. So that loss of the sister is also a larger loss of traditional ways. And the symbol becomes, something related to the sister's sense of sacrifice as well. In the last line of the story, it's the son that poses this question when he says, in that moment of knowledge, don't you think, being who she was, of the old sort of Anishinaabe, who thinks of the good of the people first, she jumped, my father, Ndede, brother to that little girl. Don't you think she lifted her shawl and flew? So the shawl also becomes a kind of symbol of the sister or the daughter's sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and that she gave up her life in a way of helping others. So she wasn't thrown to the wolves, rather she gave up her life for the greater good to help others live and survive. So it could also be a symbol of that kind of sacrifice. So depending on your interpretation, if you were going to, write your paper on the symbolism in the shawl, you could, look at the many different, what we can read into that object. It doesn't have to be necessarily one thing. It could be more than one thing. It's sort of up to the reader to interpret symbolic meaning. And if you're writing an essay about a short story, you should always look for quotations. So you are expected to incorporate quotations into a into an essay. So usually I like to highlight while I'm reading, and just if there's something that grabs my attention or that I think is important, I'll highlight it. And then when I'm planning my essay, I'll go back to my notes and look at the highlighted passages and think about, well, how can I use these passages in my writing to prove my point? Which quotes can I use or add to my essay that will help me support my argument? So that's where you're really going to use the text in your essay by adding quotations. So some of the quotations that really stood out to me when I was reading occur. The first one is, he watched the back of the wagon and the tiny figures of his mother and sister disappeared, and something failed in him. Something broke. So that quotation you could relate it to the theme or characterization of the brother and how he has been traumatized by this experience. The word broke really stands out there to me. because it does suggest something inside of him is breaking. Nothing is literally broken, but there's a kind of psychological break. Something is destroyed inside of him. It's a wound that's going to be, impossible for him to mend completely. And we can also see that in the second part of the story, maybe his alcoholism is related to that initial traumatic event, that something broke in him, and the only way that he has to cope with it is to turn to alcohol. And then the second quotation, he told how when the wolves closed in, Anaquid had thrown her daughter to them. So that's the one version of the story that the husband tells his son, that Anaquid actually threw the daughter to them. So that really puts the blame on Anaquid, and it makes the daughter a victim. But in the second telling of the story, when the girl throws herself or lifted her shawl and flew, she becomes more of the hero, right? So in one version, she's a victim. In another version of the story, she can be seen as very heroic and brave. So depending on your perception, your interpretation of this girl's death changes completely. So these quotes sort of can be read into and interpreted depending on who's the speaker, the context in which they're spoken, who they were spoken to, and what we can do as readers to interpret the larger or deeper meaning of them. And so you can, pick the quotations that appeal most to you and that you think are going to be essential or important in proving your thesis statements. So that's how I usually look at a story. And you should also be able to just summarize the story shortly. So at the end of a story, you can practice trying to just summarize it in a few short lines just to make sure you understood what exactly happened. And some stories are harder to do that than it looks, right? So this one would be quite difficult actually to summarize in one paragraph because there is so much going on in terms of what this story is talking about and how there's almost two different stories attached to one another. So it's a lot harder to just summarize than you might think it is, but it's an essential skill as well when you're doing literary analysis to be able to sort of concisely or succinctly tell what the story is about. Okay, so these are some strategies that you can use to apply the literary devices that we've talked about to short stories. So you can, whenever you're reading, I would always go back to these ideas of characterization, symbolism, theme, key quotes, diction, setting. Those are sort of the main ones that you really want to look at or apply once you're reading any type of literature.